Today for ADG Pro, we're going to be doing a bit of an investigation into the old Kroz games made by Scott Miller in the very early days of Apogee software. Now, these games were inspired by Rogue and old treasure hunting movies like Indiana Jones, and would serve as the direct inspiration for the ZZT and MegaZooks game creation systems later on. But one mechanic which wasn't in Rogue nor in those later GCSs and would remain exclusive to Kroz, at least as a built-in feature, were the whips. Your main method of self-defense in Kroz are whips, and for the most part, hitting anything dangerous with your whip will destroy it instantly. But there's a couple problems. And the first is that you have a limited quantity of whips at your disposal, and thus you have to be very careful about when and where you use them. The second, however, is that your whips are also used to break through certain kinds of walls. But unlike most things which go down in one hit, breakable walls are RNG. They might go down in a single hit, or you may burn through every whip you have and still not take the wall out. So this is what we're going to investigate today, is what is the RNG for destroying breakable walls with your whips? Now, before we go any further, I do want to point out that I'm only going to be covering the updated Kroz games and not the originals, for two reasons. The first is that the updated games just control better overall, so there's almost no reason to ever go back and play the originals. But the second is that all the updated games all share the same code, meaning there shouldn't be any differences in the whip mechanics between all 7 of the main Kroz games. Now, if that doesn't make a lot of sense, go back and watch my old video on the Kroz series as I explain the weirdness of how there's technically only 7 Kroz games when there are in fact 12 official Kroz game releases, as 5 of them may have different names, but are merely older versions of the other 7, with a few level differences. Now, we could technically just dive into the source code and look up the answer that way, but where's the fun in that? Let's instead gather some empirical data. Now basically, what I intend to do is gather up a bunch of whips, find a good place to save, and then start whacking at the walls with the whips, keeping count of how many total attempts have been made to break a wall, along with how many succeeded. For simplicity's sake, I'm going to be playing Caverns of Kroz 2, as this is considered the easiest game in the set, meaning it should theoretically take less effort to do all of this testing. I'm also going to be playing the game in Novice mode. Again, the only major difference between the skill modes, as far as I'm aware, is your starting gear. Novice starts you with 20 gems and 10 whips, Experience starts you with 15 gems and 0 whips, while Advanced starts you with 10 gems and 0 whips. Though these starting numbers might be different for different games, I'm not really quite sure on that. Regardless, starting with an extra 10 whips is going to make testing the whips easier for obvious reasons. The other catch, though, has to do with how saving works. When you save your game, it saves the state the game was in at the start of a level, meaning the best levels to test the whips out on will be levels which start with minimal enemies, tons of breakable walls, and can be reached with a good quantity of whips remaining. Now, it's also important that I get a good chunk of data first before the first power ring shows up. Now, the power rings supposedly increase the strength of your whips, allowing them to break through breakable walls more easily. So that's something we're going to need to test separately on top of the other tests, just to see how much of a change occurs to the RNG with each power ring acquired. Now, because of the sheer quantity of values I need to keep track of to check all of this, I needed to come up with a good method of counting the walls broken versus not broken. Well, I managed to get to level 6 here with 20 whips in stock, and this level's chock full of breakable walls and ways to get into spots where you're surrounded on 7 out of 8 sides by breakable walls. So, what I did was record the footage ahead of time, making sure to space out my whips to account for my own cognition, and only starting a whip sequence if surrounded by 7 breakable walls. Now, if I couldn't find a space to move to with that many, I'd use a teleport to try elsewhere on the map. Now, once there were 3 walls remaining or less, I'd move on to a different set of 7 walls. And once I ran out of whips, I'd reload and start over. In total, I performed 12 cycles worth of whipping at walls and reloading. Then, while playing back the recorded footage to count the walls, I'd start each sequence of walls attacked with a 7, since I intentionally never started whipping unless there were 7 walls to start with surrounding the player. Then with each whip used, I'd record how many walls were left. Now if I moved on to a new spot, I'd go to the next line of my data, or if I ran out of whips, I'd add in a row of hyphens just to keep things separated out and easier to read. Now, doing all of this left me with data which looked like this. Each line starts with a 7, as every initial whip used would attempt to hit 7 walls. Each number following is the number of walls left after each whip before moving on to another spot. To better explain how this works, this 75442 here means I started by whipping at 7 walls and 2 broke, leaving 5. I whipped again, 1 broke, and I was left with 4. Whipped again, but none broke, so I still had 4 left. then whipped one more time, 2 broke, and was left with 2 walls remaining. Altogether, this means a total of 20 attempts were made to break walls, 7 plus 5 plus 4 plus 4, and of those 20 attempts, 5 were successful, 7 minus 2. Once I had all of this data accumulated, it was time to culminate it together, but I didn't quite feel like doing it by hand, so I whipped up a quick and dirty program in QBasic to do it all for me. Given this is pretty much all simple addition and subtraction, but tons of it, writing the program was really simple. Plus I was able to write it in such a way that I could input the data exactly as I had written it down to make the process even faster. Now mind you, when you write code this fast, it usually breaks pretty easily, as demonstrated, but its small size made it easy to fix up all the bugs. And once it was working properly, I input every bit of data I had, and the final result was this. Now in total, 1,580 strikes were made against breakable walls, and of those strikes, 451 broke the wall down. This means the percentage chance for each individual wall to break when using a whip in the Kroz games is roughly 28.5%. This fluctuated a bit between 28 and 29% while I was inputting the data, so it's safe to say 28.5% is about the average. Which is actually a very interesting result. Now I'm not going to dive super deep into how random number generators work, but the basics is that the RNG itself spits out a number with its own predefined range, and it's up to the programmer to truncate or stretch that result to fit the specific range desired. Now oftentimes, to make this process more straightforward, a coder will write their own random number routine, which does all the dirty work behind the scenes so that it can simply be fed a minimum value and a maximum value and produce a result within that range anytime a random number is required. To that end, it's very common for random outcomes to link up to some kind of nice-looking odds, which make more sense than a percentage with a decimal value. And this is why 28.5443% is interesting, because it's extremely close to 28.5714%, which is exactly a 2 in 7 chance. Which is even more interesting because that's a 1 in 6 chance, a dice roll, with +1 added to both sides of the odds. Adding the same value to both sides of the odds ensures that no matter how much you add to it, the result never reaches 100%, but will instead always be a random chance that improves with each increase. If this is how it's being done, grabbing a power ring would theoretically bring us up to 3 in 8 odds, or a 37.5% chance, while a second power ring would bring us up to 4 in 9 odds, or a 44.4 repeating percent chance. So let's make some more progress into the game and see if this theory pans out. Now once I acquired the first power ring in level 9, the next task was to find a good place where lots of wall whipping could be done right from the start in a controlled fashion. However, a lot of the levels following weren't really providing much to work with. Though I do have a tip I failed to mention way back when I covered Kroz. When you encounter these randomly generated levels, if there's something unique in the level, like a chest or a key, you can just save and then reload over and over and over again until the thing you want is placed within easy reach. I got super lucky after a few randomizations here on level 13 and spawned right next to an extra key and a staircase. Eventually, I made it up to level 18, where finally there were a large quantity of breakable walls I could work with. Plus, look at that. The next power ring is here, and it's in a quick and easy to reach spot. So, I set to task testing the powered up whip again, plus was able to test having 2 power rings immediately following. In this case, since the breakable walls were forming a sort of spiral, I had to make do with always starting with 6 breakable walls surrounding me instead of 7. And would move on to a new batch of 6 once I was down to 2 or less. Also, since I was going through more whips with each attempt, I decided to just do half a dozen runs for having 1 power ring, and another half dozen for having 2 power rings. I plugged the results of the first run with just 1 power ring into the odds calculator I made, and the final result was 1,042 walls whipped with 451 breaks, making it roughly a 43.28215% chance for each wall hit to break. Now this is a curious result because it's very close to the 44.4 repeating percent chance I'd expect from 2 power ring increases instead of 1, suggesting each additional power ring actually adds +2 to both sides of the odds calculation instead of just +1, meaning the odds of each wall breaking went from 2 in 7 to 4 in 9. Now, does this mean having 2 power rings brings us up from 4 in 9 to 6 in 11? If it does, the percent result we'll see once we plug all the data in should be around 54.54545%. So I plugged in all the data for having 2 power rings, resulting in 894 walls whipped and 489 breaks, making for a percent chance for each wall to break of 54.69799. Yeah, seems like we've got this figured out. Based on this, we can extrapolate the odds for each wall breaking with greater and greater quantities of power rings without having to do all the testing. 3 power rings would be an 8 in 13 chance, or about 61.5%. 4 power rings would be a 10 in 15 chance, which is exactly 2/3, or 66.6 repeating percent. 5 power rings would be 12 in 17, or about 70.5%, and 6 power rings would be 14 in 19, or roughly a 73.5% chance. But now we get to do something we typically won't get an opportunity to do in these pro videos, as the free release of all the Kroz games also came with source code. Not only does this reveal that the Kroz games were written in Pascal, but this means we can dive right into the code itself and find the procedures which determine what the odds of breaking the walls truly are. Which, yes, we could have done right from the start, but again, where's the fun in that, right? Like, coming up with methods to test these kinds of things when browsing source code isn't an option is definitely a good skill to have. I will admit though, if not for having access to the source code, I would have kept going to test even more power ring levels to be certain, but I think by this point I've proven the theory of how to do this. In any case, one thing that immediately struck me as interesting is that internally, the whip power is being calculated as 2 right from the start. Though you can also see there's apparently an extra difficulty setting beyond Novice, Experienced, and Advanced, which is supposed to boost your starting capabilities. I tested this out, and sure enough, entering X as your difficulty selection puts you into a secret mode, which starts you with 250 gems, 100 whips, 1 power ring, 50 teleports, and a spare key. However, here's the moment you've all been waiting for. The code which determines whether a breakable wall breaks to a whip or not will now be revealed. And I was overcomplicating it. I did indeed have the 2 in 7 odds correct as the base state, but the way this code is written, only the first number in those odds increases when you get a power ring, not both. And interestingly enough, the odds are very similar to what I predicted for the first couple of rings. But as you can see, since only the first number in the odds increases, it'll eventually reach 7 out of 7, meaning with 5 power rings, you're guaranteed to destroy all breakable walls around you with every whip consumed. Again, had I continued playing through the game and testing more power rings, I would have spotted this. But I think making such a mistake was, in a way, a better outcome, as it allowed me to describe an interesting concept when it comes to doing random number generation, which some of you may want to utilize in your own projects someday. Anywho, that's all for today's episode of ADG Pro. Next up will be a standard review, episode 275, and the game we're going to be taking a look at isn't one I was planning to cover this year, but hey, given some of the recent news regarding remakes of old DOS titles, I think it's a good idea to tackle it sooner rather than later, so be sure to tune in next Saturday to see what I've got in store. Thanks for watching, everyone, and extra special thanks to those of you supporting me on Patreon. Here's just a small set of you guys.